Hi everyone, it's Katie back with another episode of my vlog, and I actually had a viewer request. A couple of different viewers asked me to post a basic knitting tutorial. So, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of basic knitting tutorials out there online already, but I thought, you know what? I'll take a crack at this also. I can teach you guys how to knit. So I went ahead and filmed a little basic knitting tutorial. What I did was I talked a little bit about tools and materials in the first part of this video, and then the second part gets into the basics of how to cast on, how to do the basic knit stitch, and how to cast off at the end of your piece of knitting, which is exactly what you need to know to get started knitting. I love knitting. I love sharing knitting with other people. I would love it if you learned how to knit by watching my video. So I'm gonna get off this intro now and get right into it. We'll talk tools and materials first, and then I will show you guys how to knit. Okay, so before we get started with the actual lesson, let's talk for a minute about materials. You only need two things to knit. You need yarn and knitting needles. Now, there's a lot of choice in yarn and knitting needles. In yarn, there's choices of materials, and there's choices of size of the yarn. I've got a selection of yarns here on my table. This is an acrylic yarn. This is a wool yarn. This is a cotton yarn. These last two are wool also. And I have a range of sizes from what we would call a DK, worsted weight, sock yarn, which is considerably thinner, and then lace yarn, which is the thinnest that I knit with. This sweater here is sock yarn. It's actually this yarn right here, knit using number 2 size needles, which is actually what size this needle right here is, number 2. This sweater here is knit with this worsted weight yarn on, I think it was a size 7. It might have been size 8. I need to look at my records. You can see there's quite a bit of difference in the size of the actual knit stitches from this sweater to this sweater here. I'll hold those a little closer to the camera so you guys can actually see the comparison between those. So finer yarn, smaller needle gets you smaller knit stitches. Larger yarn, larger needle gets you bigger knit stitches. There is much bigger yarn than this. You can go up to bulky, super bulky, even crazier bigger. I actually brought out a set of needle tips, which are a size 36. This is the biggest size that I have. That would be for doing like super bulky yarn for making a blanket or something like that. For beginners, I am going to recommend that you pick worsted weight yarn, that's this one, and a needle size between 6 and 9. These ones here I think are 8s. Let me check. These are 9s. So this is a straight needle, size 9. This is a great size to learn on. You use worsted weight yarn. Again, it says right on the label what size the yarn is. And there's even advice on your yarn label about what size needles to use with that yarn. But if you pick a worsted or DK weight yarn and a size 8 or 9 needle, that is perfect for learning on. Again, there's lots of options. You can make much smaller, you can go even bigger. But if you're just starting out, size 9, size 8, even down to size 7 needles, and a nice worsted weight yarn. What material should you choose? I love to knit with wool. Wool is great, wool is warm, wool is really stretchy. Here, let me unroll this guy a little bit. It has a lot of give to it, so when you're knitting with it, there's some bounce to it, and it's not so stiff on your hands. Cotton is wonderful if you want to make washcloths or things like that, but it is just not stretchy at all. Let's take a look at this cotton yarn. It's really, it's like twine. Can you hear that? It's really stiff. So it's really fun to make some first projects out of cotton because, like I said, you can make like little scrappy dishcloths or, whatever. But it's harder to knit with than wool. Wool is really nice, really, really stretchy, really flexy, really bouncy. It's got a lot of give to it. If you can't afford wool or you want something machine washable, acrylic is your best bet. It's much cheaper. It is plastic yarn, so it's not, necessarily as eco-friendly or as nice feeling as cotton or wool, but it has some give and some stretch to it. It's kind of in between cotton and wool. So those are the three fibers that I would recommend working with at first. And again, I wouldn't start out with cotton. I would start with wool or acrylic. Things like linen, hemp, they're much stiffer yarns. They're harder than cotton. And then there's a bunch of other animal yarns that get really expensive, of course. There's silk, there's Angora, there's a bunch of different stuff. But what you really want to pick out is just a basic worsted weight yarn, either wool, acrylic, or like I said, cotton maybe, but I would start with wool or acrylic with something a little stretchier. And then again, you're going to want to use straight needles to learn on. These are circular needles. This is actually what I use pretty much exclusively, which is basically just the ends of two straight needles connected by a cable. So you can do projects in the round. I'll explain what that means in a later video though. That's a more advanced technique. The one other thing for beginners that I do want to recommend is pick yourself yarn that comes in a ball or a skein shape. If you buy a beautiful hank of yarn like this, this has to be actually wound into a ball before you can knit with it. It's not that hard to do, but it is an extra step that you would have to do before you could just get to knitting. So that's my basic talk for beginners on materials. Oh, there's also novelty yarns. I don't have any to show you because I don't like them. There's, you know, fluffy yarns and yarns with extra little doodads and things spun into it. There's yarns with beads in it. There's yarns that get kind of thick and thin down the length of the yarn. I absolutely recommend staying away from those novelty yarns until you've learned the basics of knitting. Again, a simple one color. Don't mess with the variegated yarns yet. It just distracts. The other thing I would recommend for knitters is don't maybe pick a dark color like this dark blue or a black. It's harder to see. I would recommend for beginners starting with something nice and light colored like a yellow or a white where you can really see the stitch definition, excuse me. So that's it. That's my talk on materials. And now let's learn to knit. All right, are you guys ready to learn how to knit? You have your yarn and your knitting needles ready? Let's go. First things first, we have to learn how to cast on. So what you're going to want to do is take a little length of yarn. We're going to make a pretty small tail. You know, give yourself maybe 15, 18 inches or so. And you're going to want to tie a slip knot in the end of that. So a slip knot is really easy. You bend the yarn, turn it over itself. You reach through the loop you just made and grab that loose piece of yarn, pull it back through, and there's your slip knot. Easy peasy, right? Now take one of your knitting needles and put it into the slip knot and snug the slip knot up tight to the needle, okay? Then the next thing you're going to do is what's called a long tail cast on. This is the long tail. This is the live yarn that is connected to my ball of yarn over here. Long tail cast on looks complicated, but it's not. You've got your two pieces of yarn here, and what you want to do is arrange them in your hand so that you have both pieces of yarn held in your fingers like that, and then you want your index finger and your thumb in between them like this, okay? And I've got the one in the back is the one going to my ball of yarn, and the one in the front is my long tail, okay? So again, put my fingers in between the two yarns like that, and I'm holding them together with my other fingers down below, okay? And then you do this kind of funny twisty move where you reach over with the needle and you catch this part of the yarn here, and then you flip that up and go under this yarn here, and then drop it and pull it tight. And that's one stitch that you just made onto your needle. Now you have two stitches because the slip knot is the first stitch, right? So let's do that again. You come over here, you go under this part by your thumb, then you go back here and go under that and come back right through the middle, and then drop your thumb out and pull it tight. Under, under, through, drop it and pull it tight. And each time you do that, you're making another stitch on your knitting needle, okay? Through there, through there, through there, drop it. It feels a little weird the first time you do it, but once you kind of get into the rhythm, you can go pretty darn fast with this technique. Under there, through there. Did you catch it that time? So I'm just going to go ahead and cast on about 10 stitches onto my needle. Let's see. That's 9. Let's make a 10th one, okay? And then I'm going to show you guys how to do a knit stitch. I'm going to take this needle and move it onto my left hand, pick up my empty needle over here. Now, you take the tip of the right hand needle and you insert it into the first loop on the left hand needle. You see how it's going through there? It's sharing the space with the left hand needle. Then you take your live yarn, and you want to be careful, not the long tail, right? The yarn that's connected to the ball of yarn. And you're going to loop it around the right hand needle clockwise. You see that? Then you draw the right hand needle down, and with a kind of scooping motion, you grab that stitch so that it's now on the right hand needle. And then the last step is you slide the stitch off of the left hand needle. So that's one stitch made on my right hand needle. Again, you go into the first stitch. I'll turn that so you can see how they're sharing that loop of yarn together. Then you go around the right hand needle clockwise, scoop it forwards, and then pop it off the left hand needle. And that's it. That's a knit stitch right there. Go into the stitch, around the right hand needle, again clockwise, scoop it under to get that stitch onto the right hand needle, and then pop it off of the left hand needle. Poke it through, go around, scoop it under, and pull it off the needle. And that's it. And knitting is just really a series of doing that little stitch over and over and over again. And if you want to get more complicated, the next step is going to be to learn how to purl, which is the reverse of a knit stitch. But for now, let's just practice doing a knit stitch. You get yourself all the way to the end of your row. The last one usually feels a little sloppy and loose, but that's okay. Wrap it around, scoop it under, pop it off. Now, all my stitches are on my right hand needle. I'm going to switch hands again, put the right hand needle in my left hand and the empty needle in my right hand. And now you'll notice the first stitch here on this side does look a little wonky and big. It'll even out over time, but also if this is your first knitting that you're ever doing, it's going to look uneven. You're going to have different size stitches all over the place. That's okay. Just keep going. The more stitches you do, the more even you'll get. Also, at the beginning, you probably will have an inclination to hold your yarn like this while you're working and wrap it around. If you'll notice, what I do is I put my yarn in between my fingers in this kind of zigzag pattern, right? And then one more loop around my finger there, and that way I can control the tension on the yarn as it's coming off of the ball. Tension is important, but for right now, let's just learn those stitches. I already put my needle through there, so I'm going to go around, going to scoop it under, and then slide it off. On that second stitch, after I've turned, I'm going to make sure I snug this up just a little bit right before I go around, and that kind of gets rid of that weird loosey-goosey thing that was going on at the beginning of the row. So again, put it into the stitch, go around, scoop it under, slide it off. And like I said, you just keep going with that, knit every stitch, knit every row, and you're going to have what's called a garter stitch in the end. That's not going to look like a traditional knit fabric. It's going to look like kind of a bumpy fabric. The cool thing about garter stitch is it's really easy. It's a great thing to start with because you only have to know how to knit. You don't have to know how to purl. It also lies flat. Regular knitting, which is what's called stockinette stitch. I'm going to turn it around again. I'm going to start on my next row. Regular knitting, which is called stockinette stitch, involves knitting the stitches on one side and purling them on the other. Again, second stitch of the row, I'm going to put my needle in here. Oh, sometimes it's hard to find the spot. And I'm going to snug this up just a little bit right before I wrap around for that second stitch. And that really does a good job of getting rid of kind of that weird loose open loop that you can get on the end there. Okay, move my ball of yarn so it's not in the background of what I'm doing. So again, you just keep knitting across, get yourself to the end of the row, keep on knitting, And once you get to that last stitch on the row, you're just going to want to turn it around and start again on the back side of that row. And as you go, you'll start to see this, like I said, this sort of bumpy ridged fabric, which is called garter stitch, starts to emerge there. Oh, I was saying stockinette stitch, which is regular, what you would think of as regular knitting. It doesn't lie flat the way that garter stitch does. So a lot of times when people make their first piece that's made in regular stockinette stitch, again, that's knit on one side and purl on the other, they're kind of disappointed when they're done because it starts curling up on the edges and it doesn't want to lie flat. So I always recommend people start with garter stitch because number one, it's easier. All you're doing is knitting, no purling necessary. But also it lies down nice and flat so that when you're done with your piece, you don't have it curling up all over the place. So that's pretty sensible, right? All right, I'm gonna knit a few more rows on this so that we have a more sizable swatch, and then I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna show you guys how to cast off or end your row of knitting so that you can actually take it off of the needles and do something with it. All right, guys, I have added a few more rows onto this sample swatch. Now you can really see that nice ridged fabric that I was talking about. That is garter stitch. It does look the same on both sides, and it does lie nice and flat on the edges. So I'm going to stop this one here and show you how to cast off, but what I recommend you guys do is keep going. Maybe make your sample a little bit wider than this, maybe cast on, 16 or 20 stitches instead of 10. And if you just keep going, make it long enough and you have a scarf, right? Or you can just cast off after making a little square like this and just do a bunch of little practice pieces. As with anything, practice helps you get better and better and better. It's challenging at first, but if you keep up with it, you'll get good in no time. So let's learn how to cast off. It's very similar to knitting, but there's just one extra step, okay? So I'm going to put my right needle in here on the first stitch, just like I'm doing regular knitting. And I am just going to knit this stitch, same as I've done before. And then I'm gonna knit the second stitch, snug that up a little, like I said. And then before I knit the third stitch, I'm going to take the tip of my left hand needle and put it through the first stitch on the right hand needle there. And I'm going to carefully slide towards the end and then pop the first stitch over that second stitch. Do you see that? Leaving one stitch on the right hand needle. Then I knit the next stitch, just like normal. And then before I knit the next stitch, I'm going to take that first stitch, on the right hand needle and bring it over the second one. And again, knit the next stitch. Then using the left hand needle, pull that first stitch over the second stitch. And you don't want to pull too tight on this. You want to do this nice and loose. If you cast off too tightly, you can get this kind of bunched up edge at the end, right? So again, knit the next stitch. Take the needle and slide the first stitch over the second stitch. So you're just putting it through the other stitch to stop it unraveling. Knit one, slide one over. You got it? Pretty simple. I'm not going to repeat the instruction a bunch of times because I know you guys can back the video up if you want to see it again. But the idea is you just knit and then slide that further away one over the closer one. And you get this lovely little finished edge on the top there. Okay? Oh, got 3 more stitches. So we'll do knit that, slide that one over, knit the next one, slide that one over, knit the next one, slide this one over that one, and then you can either cut your yarn here and pull it through, or I like to do one more that. Then I cut my yarn, pull it through, slide it off the needle, and you're done. There's your knitted swatch of fabric. Look at that, a little square. So you got a nice little finished edge at the top where you cast off, a nice edge at, excuse me, the beginning where you cast on. Some lovely little garter stitch fabric in between, lies nice and flat. And that's it. Now you know how to knit. Hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know if you want to see more and come back with how to purl and all kinds of other techniques in the future if you'd like.